Cool. So, obviously, this topic is not light, so I want to provide a content warning. Obviously, we'll be discussing themes of wartime sexual violence and abuse. I will not be going into grave detail, but some might find the content difficult to engage with. So, I won't be offended if you need to step out of the virtual room, so to speak, or mute me at any time. And this talk is based on a combination of different papers that I'm working on and my PhD. So some of the conclusions might seem a bit broad and might raise more questions than answers. So I welcome any suggestions that you have at the end as well. So with that disclaimer addressed, I would be remiss to not ground ourselves into the current conflicts and realities of what is going on around the world today. So as of April 23rd, 2024, the UN has verified 3,688 cases of rape and other forms of sexual violence committed in war during 2023. This marks a dramatic increase of 50% compared to the previous year. So Pramila Patten, the Secretary General's Special Representative on Sexual Violence in Conflict, presented her report recently at the UN Security Council, and this report examines incidents, patterns, and trends in 21 situations of concern, including those in Israel and Gaza, Sudan, Ukraine, Haiti, Myanmar, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo. In most of these cases, 95% involved women and girls. In 32% of the incidents, children, predominantly girls, were victims, while 21 cases targeted individuals from the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, and intersex community. Patton emphasized that these numbers do not accurately reflect the global scale or prevalence of a chronically underreported and historically hidden crime. The report highlights how sexual violence has hindered women's livelihoods and girls' education during unprecedented levels of displacement. She also pointed out, quote, that sexual violence perpetrated with impunity remains profitable in the political economy of war, end quote. For example, armed groups in Haiti continue to generate revenue by using the threat of sexual violence to extort higher ransoms for captives. And the report identifies 58 parties that are credibly suspected of committing or being responsible for sexual violence, with a majority of these being non-state actors. Over 70% of these are classified as persistent perpetrators, meaning they have appeared on the list for 5 or more years. Children, among the most vulnerable groups, are at particular risk during times of war and conflict. Currently, 426 million children globally live in conflict zones, with 72 million residing near armed groups that perpetuate sexual violence against them. Children have historically been exploited for various purposes, including child soldiers, cheap labor, and they continue to face sexual exploitation today, echoing practices from the Roman period. So let's transition to Rome and look at a brief background on Roman attitudes towards slavery and abuse as it relates to sexual violence, particularly focusing on the potential realities that women and children face during conflicts involving Rome. So, to provide clearer insights into the role of captives in Roman slave society, the institution of slavery was deeply connected to Roman views on masculinity and sexuality. This exposure contributed to the vulnerability experienced by enslaved women and children. And in the context of Roman slavery, it could be argued that sexual encounters between masters and enslaved individuals do not align with what we would term for children as child abuse in modern terms. And also, the concept of child sexual abuse is a contemporary idea, and we must remember that. The ancient Romans held markedly different perspectives on sexual abuse compared to our modern sensibilities, with sexual behaviors being understood as culturally defined terms. In Roman society, it was socially, ethically, and legally permissible to engage in sexual acts with enslaved individuals, including children, as documented by sources such as Plutarch's Moralia. Additionally, Roman law did not protect enslaved individuals, women and children included, from sexual encounters. So the Roman concept of hostage and captive is also intrinsically linked with wartime sexual violence. So Cicero stated that rape is a custom of war, and Virgil equated the enslavement of captives with rape. At the same time, Dionysius of Halicarnassus labels rape as essential for a captive. So, wartime rape committed by the Romans could be classified as a manifestation of a pathological character to uphold the custom of war and seen as an essential act expected to befall women and children taken captive. I should say that I'm not saying that this also does not happen to captive men. Absolutely does. That is a whole other topic that would constitute a whole other talk that I would love to give another time. This today, obviously, I'd be focusing on women and children specifically. So, in the biography of Augustus, Suetonius credits Augustus with being the first to take a new kind of hostage, namely women. However, this claim is incorrect, as Scipio is first evidence to have done this. Wartime sexual violence, both literarily and pictorially, models the definition of what a hostage and captive are. So, contrary to Roman literary evidence that suggests that general captives should be met with abuse and assault, and noble hostages and captives should not, uh, as we will see, this is not the case. Captive women who fall into both categories could and were sexually abused, as evidenced by the primary source material. Also, the quality of clothing displayed on the women in Roman conquest art is the only factor that distinguishes them between the elite and non elite. Also, the function of a captive and a hostage during wartime differs. So, they have two functions that are defined specifically by social status. So, one, noble captive women taken as political hostages to ensure a lasting peace between enemy and Rome. And then you have noble and non noble captive women and children taken hostage to be tortured in front of their families to create fear and force compliance and submission of the enemy. So, noble captives in the literature were individuals of high birth, whether male or female, who continued to submit and align themselves with Rome. These noble captives can be broken down into two groups: the family and relatives related by blood and marriage to the primary adversary, and the commander and friends of the king or chief whose bonds to him were political and who were military opponents of Rome. As the artistic and literary evidence shows, the nobility of a female hostage did not protect her from wartime sexual violence. Um, and I will continue to look at our first type of hostage, who, as women, are taken to be used to coerce peace. So, the Romans believed that noble and non noble captive women, when necessary, could be used as hostages in coercive and threatening ways. Women were lucrative because they could be assaulted or threatened to be assaulted in front of their families to shame them and the local community, thereby enforcing submission of the group to Roman rule and conquest. Taking women as hostages to be tortured could guarantee the enemy's submission to Rome and quell their future attempts at rebellion for fear of their women being tortured again. Dionysius, writing in his History of Rome around 7 BCE, relayed information about the conflict between the patrician ruling class and the plebeian lower class that occurred between 495 BCE and 493. So we're looking at a civil war here. So he says he has made it evident that in Republican Rome, even Roman women of the plebeian class could be taken as hostage and tortured to ensure subjugation and compliance. If the Romans were willing to do this to their own women, they could easily utilize non-Roman and non-noble hostages as leverage to ensure their men avoided conflict with Rome, instead of resorting to treaties and submitting themselves unarmed to whatever was asked of them. Sexual violence must be one of these ignominious tortures that Dionysius describes here, and one that Belzer could say inscribes the impotence of defeated men through the violated bodies of their women. So Dionysius describes these acts as being committed in front of family members. This would obviously bring about psychological violence to the bystanders who are forced to watch and are unable to intervene, forcing the family and community to experience their helplessness and display their inability to protect their loved ones from the conqueror. Dionysus here calls this connection between family members a natural tie. So, this natural tie could be exploited through the act of sexual violence and abuse. The link between sexual violence acting as a forced submission and the psychological effects it brings results in the normalization of this treatment towards captive women. It is unclear in the literary and artistic evidence if the hostages used for torture were then let go or enslaved. But what we do know from this is fear was used as a weapon and instilled in women, men, and children who beheld such an act, as described by Dionysus, forcing the family unit and entire group to submit. In majority of scenes in Conquest art, women are depicted in accompaniment of either their children, their husbands, or other captive women. So now that I've briefly kind of covered these historical contexts around sexual violence and captivity for women and children, I want to explore a bit of queer theory and how we can apply this to the imagery. I will then follow up with a representation of sexual vulnerability of captive children in Aurelian art, particularly on the column of Marcus Aurelius, to explore the application of feminist materialism. So, the imagery of Roman conquest resulted from violent cultural interactions between Rome and northern barbarians, and how the Romans interpreted the outcomes of those interactions. These visual images reflect or mirror Roman society's values, imaginations, and traditions. In particular, the state of these societal elements is most revealing during times of crisis or transitions, as argued by Paul Zanker. Interpreting the state of values, imagination, and tradition in these Roman images can be challenging. Reason for this lies in the active role these depictions play in constructing societal elements of Roman culture that are constantly responding to critical events, thus revealing the discourse of the ruling class and their contact with people that they perceived as barbaric or lacking the core value of humanitas. It also is related to the challenge of ruling diverse cultures and conceptualizing these distant places and people. Nandini Pandey, I think, expertly explains this as diversity as being a symptom of trauma, as diversity is the movement and most of the time forced movement of people. So conquest imagery can boil down the diversity of people in the northern provinces specifically to stock images, commodifying the bodies of the conquered and thereby weaponizing diversity. So shame and humiliation were the main motivational characteristics behind wartime sexual violence, with many assaults occurring in front of the family or the public, as we have seen through Dionysus's account. This is particularly true for captive women on conquest iconography, and it appears through the first 200 century, CE, with women who have gestures suggesting wartime rape, always accompanied by those onlookers. Similarly, when the former Yugoslavia was under investigation by the European Union for sexual slavery, sexual violence, and ethnic cleansing in the 1990s, 5 distinctive patterns of sexual violence were identified. And one is important here. In conjunction with fighting, public rape of selected women in front of the assembled population occurred after the domination of a village. In many of the scenes in Column of Marcus Aurelius, captive women who appear to have these gestures, like this woman here with her exposed breast, shoulder, are parallel to scenes of burning huts and the destruction of local population. So the women in these scenes invite the viewer to imagine the rape occurred during the domination of their village. Two core motifs of captive barbarians have been identified in Roman visual culture. The first one represents the subjugation of barbarian lands and families, symbolizing the total destruction of non-Roman lineage. Roman imperial dynastic success demanded complete generational victory. Thus, representations of conquest necessarily involved elements of gender and sex. To convey the annihilation of a generation, the imagery targeted the bodies that produce life. Natalie Campion in Gender Theory in Roman Art in 1996 examined how gender operated as a model for social relations through depictions of barbarian couples on monuments, gems, cameos, and sarcophagi. She argues that these couples illustrate male aggression and female passivity as normative behaviors among non Romans. Ian Ferris, later in 2009, supports this interpretation, suggesting that bound barbarian men signify male aggression, while unbound, mournful barbarian women represent passivity and a non threat. Additionally, Campion concludes that the depiction of barbarian couples underscores Roman power over conquered peoples by portraying the irreversible disruption of barbarian familial and social structures. Paul Zenker, in his analysis on the column of Marcus Aurelius, argues that the sorrowful figures of barbarian women symbolize the destruction of social unity among conquered families. Natalie Campion also suggests that the pairing of male and female barbarians emphasizes their perceived commonality with Romans, implying the potential for, quote, Romanization under the right circumstances. However, this interpretation is problematic as the imagery consistently depicts submission as a violent, coercive process. And moreover, the presence of these figures in Roman art reinforces the ideology of an ever expanding empire. The second motif positions barbarian women as embodiments of the fundamental differences between Roman and non Roman identities, emphasizing ethnic and social inferiority. This contrast reinforced Roman identity and power dynamics. Enslavement through warfare, symbolized by the captive barbarian here, served as a visual testament to the power and prestige of the imperial family as well. So, in Roman conquest iconography, we have the depiction of what is seemingly younger captive women with disheveled hair and tunics, slipping to reveal bare shoulders or breast, symbolizing the threat of sexual assault and exploitation. And here we have an example from the Tropæum Alpium, dated to the Augustan period, celebrating his quote unquote final pacification of the Alpine tribes in southern Gaul. These figures embody what can be termed as the ideal captive. So their ethnicity was interchangeable, signified by stylized dress, allowing Roman audiences to associate them with specific groups, in many cases the Gauls or typically northern barbarians, often shown in scenes of capture, transportation, or in this case, trophy display. From a Roman perspective, informed by literary sources, this ideal captive was constructed with a discourse of passive femininity that reinforced heteronormative and social hierarchies embedded in conquest and subjugation, as previously mentioned by Natalie Campion. Warfare itself was feminized and metaphorically linked to sexual penetration of foreign lands as well. As evidenced by Octavian's army at Perugia in 41 to 40 BCE, whose led shots, you can see at the bottom right-hand corner here, bore vulgar sexual inscriptions. This perspective is further reflected in visual personifications of pacified lands, such as the frieze from the Sebastian at Aphrodisias on the left-hand side here, which depicts Claudius attacking a female figure of Britannia who appears to have suffered wartime sexual violence. However, this Roman narrative overlooks the lived experiences of women during warfare. While young women and girls were primary targets during conquest and punitive actions against revolts, such as when Scipio was offered a beautiful young captive in 209 BCE after the fall of New Carthage, the reality for these women was far more complex. Although some women may have fit the Roman ideal youthful beauty, many did not conform to this archetype. This raises important questions about the construction of beauty in this context and how such idealizations obscured the diversity of experiences and appearances among the women who suffered at the hands of Roman soldiers. The reductive portrayal of the ideal captive erases individuality, reducing these women to mere symbols within a broader narrative of a conquest and domination. So, a feminist interpretation of the ideal captive motif recognizes the gestures suggesting wartime sexual violence and abuse as signifiers of the destruction of the barbarian familial structures. In this context, the threat to the female body symbolizes a threat to the national body. Moreover, applying feminist theory to the viewer's gaze suggests two types. So you have scopophilic and sadistic voyeurism. Scopophilia fragments the woman's body into revealing parts, breasts, shoulders, face, legs, and hair, while sadistic voyeurism derives pleasure from observing women's suffering from a safe distance or imagining oneself as the cause of their pain. These frameworks have been applied to Roman frescoes in Pompeii and other pieces of Roman art by David Frederick and Koloski Ostro and Beth Severy Hoven. These interpretations reveal that captive women were constructed for the male gaze, enabling safe visual consumption without challenging male sexual insecurities. However, this particular feminist perspective is limited as it focuses primarily on male spectatorship and risks overlooking other layers of meaning and the diverse experiences of women beyond these stereotypes. So, enter queer theory. So, this provides a broader lens that reveals that power is not static, but requires constant reinforcement through repetition. In this case, the repeated gestures implying sexual violence, such as disheveled hair, exposed shoulders, breasts, and vulnerable postures, reinforce power structures like empire and the imagery that upholds this dominance, including the ideal war captive. Judith Butler's concept of performativity is particularly relevant here. Power is maintained by repeatedly enacting certain gestures, behaviors, and representations that naturalize hierarchical structures. These visual motifs do more than simply depict historical events. They actively construct and perpetuate ideologies of dominance and subjugation. The consistent portrayal of female captives as passive and sexually vulnerable reinforces this narrative of Roman superiority and justifies imperial conquest by positioning non Roman societies as weak, feminized, and deserving of domination. By repeatedly representing the female captive as sexually exposed and powerless, Roman art creates a cultural script that naturalizes both the sexual exploitation of conquered peoples and the expansion of Roman power. Moreover, this repetition produces a specific form of gendered and sexualized power. The captive woman's body becomes a site where imperial power is inscribed and reinscribed through gestures that suggest sexual availability and vulnerability. This visual language links the act of conquest to sexual domination, framing territorial expansion as a form of masculine penetration and control. In doing so, the imagery simultaneously constructs Roman masculinity as virile and dominant, while positioning the conquered as feminized and submissive. Queer theory also challenges the notion of a singular fixed gaze. While feminist interpretations often focus on the male gaze as the primary mode of viewing these images, queer theory suggests that spectatorship is more fluid and complex. The repeated depiction of sexually vulnerable captives invites a range of viewerships and desires, potentially disrupting heteronormative interpretations. This opens up questions about how these images might have been consumed by diverse audiences within Romanist provinces, including enslaved peoples, women, or those who did not conform to Roman norms of gender and sexuality. Furthermore, queer theory reveals how power relations are unstable and require constant reinforcement to appear natural. Repetition of these visual motifs works to mask the fragility of Roman power by projecting an image of absolute control. However, the need to continually restage the dominance over captive bodies suggests an underlying anxiety about the stability of imperial power and the potential for resistance. So, in this light, the ideal war captive is not merely a symbol of Roman victory, but an active participant in the performative maintenance of empire. By continually reenacting the power dynamics of conquest and sexual domination, Roman art not just reflects imperial power, it constitutes and legitimizes it. So the captive woman, therefore, is not merely a passive victim, but a central figure in the performative economy of Roman imperialism, essential to the construction and perpetuation of empire itself. All right. Now let's move on to new feminist materialist theory. So, this is an approach within feminist thought that focuses on the agency of materiality. and how bodies, objects, and environments interact to produce gendered and social realities. This approach has been utilized in Roman art most recently by Ruth Belfeld, Ava Moll, and Noel Linsky, who demonstrated how material interactions are gendered and socially constructed within power dynamics. This framework challenges traditional divides between nature and culture, mind and body, subject and object, arguing that all bodies, human and non human, are co constituted by their material conditions and relationships. It focuses on issues like vulnerability, oppression, agency, and embodiment. So, and when applying this theory to the study of visual language of sexual vulnerability ascribed to the bodies of enslaved children in Roman art, this allows for a more nuanced, embodied understanding of how these depictions reinforce power, gender, and vulnerability in material and social terms. It prompts new questions about how these representations were used to convey vulnerability in terms of social and political context, shedding light on how Roman society conceptualized the importance of enslaving children. So, in imperial iconography in the 2nd century CE, specifically on Aurelian art, non Roman children are typically restricted to conquest genre, appearing predominantly in 3 scenes. So, violent military activity, submission, and triumph. This recurring imagery underscores how, within Roman society, warfare was not just a political tool, but a bodily one that required the conquered to participate in a forceful engagement with the conqueror. So, here, primarily focusing on scenes of conflict, non Roman children are often depicted as forcibly separated from their mothers by Roman soldiers, pushed toward military officials, or clutching tightly to their mothers in a state of distress. These depictions reflect the tension between the maternal and the militaristic forces that pull them apart. These visual arrangements not only highlight the emotional and physical vulnerability of the children, but also emphasize the entanglement of their bodies with those of the conquerors. Children are often placed between their parents and the Roman soldiers, drawing a direct connection between the bodies of the defeated and the invaders. This dynamic creates a material exchange of power, where the child's body evokes a complex interplay of innocence and exploitation, raising questions about agency and vulnerability in the face of overpowering militaristic forces. For the following, we'll look at gestures as what I would like to call gestures of association between children and their parents on the column of Marcus Aurelius. So, this portrayal of captive children alongside their mothers underscores a profound sense of shared suffering, particularly as scenes of violence often associate captive women and their children with gestures that imply sexual vulnerability. So, as previously discussed, these women and mothers here are depicted with disheveled hair, hands gripping their heads, or tunics pulled down to expose their shoulders and breasts, postures that imply the imminent threat or having suffered sexual assault. The presence of male children in these scenes adds further complexity. In many Roman depictions, male children are not only depicted as vulnerable bystanders, but also targets of conquest, subject to the same objectifying gaze and dehumanization as women. Here, the art mirrors the lived reality of these children. During wartime, male children are just as much under threat of suffering wartime sexual abuse as female children. It is plausible to argue here that the children depicted in scenes alongside their mothers, whose gestures suggest this imminent or reoccurring sexual violence, are equally at risk, creating a collective experience in the scene. So in scene 102, in the center of the screen here, a young girl is held in protection by her mother, who displays these gestures that indicate she's experienced such violence. This physical connection suggests a disturbing implication. The girl may face a similar fate once separated from her mother's protection. The mother exerts her remaining agency by raising her right hand offensively against nearby Roman soldiers who are busy setting local huts ablaze. This action not only emphasizes their immediate peril, but also foreshadows the potential shift of the soldier's focus onto the vulnerable mother daughter duo once he completes destroying their home. It also illustrates resistance as a material practice that challenges the deterministic narratives of victimhood. Similarly, in scene 104 on the right-hand side of the screen here, the narrative continues with another violent image. A mother forcefully pulled by a Roman soldier by her wrist clutches her son who desperately clings to her. The mother's gesture that suggests she experiences sexual violence are indicative of a broader theme where the violence directed primarily at women casts a shadow over their children as well. So these scenes transcend mere depictions of individual bodies. They intertwine their experiences, illustrating a network of vulnerability to sexual violence in the face of conquest. In both instances, the interactions among the bodies of mother and child reveal a collective experience of trauma and fear, highlighting the pervasive impact of wartime sexual violence on children during conflict. So, in line with feminist new materialism, these bodies are not merely passive subjects to be consumed. Rather, they are active agents in the reproduction of power, suggesting that the vulnerability of the children is not merely represented, but is actively produced through a complex web of visual, material, and historical forces. The vulnerability of the children portrayed in these scenes does not serve solely to evoke pity or pathos. Instead, it stands as a critical site of imperial power, where the material bodies of the subjugated are objectified, exposed, and ultimately controlled. Additionally, by considering the materiality of these children's bodies alongside the trauma experienced by their mothers, we can better understand how Roman art contributes to reproducing and materializing the imperial violence that permeates the empire. As scholars in New Materialism argue, the agencies of these bodies is connected to the material world and the processes that render them vulnerable and exposed through the gaze of the conqueror and the historical forces of domination that continue to shape their existence. So ultimately, these depictions do not merely reflect the violence of the time, they actively participate in the reproduction of power, with the vulnerability of both women and children serving as an embodied and material expression of conquest. Thank you very much.
I've just seen that Anna's had to go out for a fire alarm. So thank you, Kelsey. That was excellent, and very interesting, really. I'd like to open the floor open to questions at this point, I think. If people would like to put those in the chat or raise their hand, if well, virtually raise their hand if they've got any. I believe Sarah's got one.